The biosample chamber smelled like nothing. Kyle had noticed that first, how the quorum's filtration system stripped even the mineral tang from recycled air, leaving only temperature and pressure against his skin. He'd been cataloguing the breathing patterns of crystalline moss from Kepler 442b when Earth's final transmission reached station Aldebaran 7. 317 survivors. Integration assessment pending. He didn't stop his work. The moss required precise atmospheric readings every 40 minutes, and the quorum valued precision above all else. His hands moved through the documentation protocol while the words "final transmission" settled somewhere below his sternum, a weight he couldn't measure with their instruments. 6 months earlier, he'd chosen the outpost assignment: xenobiology research, deep space, minimal human contact. His colleagues had called it career suicide. Kyle had called it necessary. He'd spent 5 years teaching planetary ecology to students who wanted quick answers, who grew impatient with observation periods measured in seasons. Out here, time moved differently. Species emerged and adapted across centuries. No one expected immediate results. The quorum researcher arrived exactly on schedule, biosuite flickering with translation matrices. "Dr. Ryson, you will relocate to residential block theta. Human integration protocols require species-specific oversight." Kyle's fingers paused over the data tablet. "I'm not qualified for psychological assessment. You possess xenobiological training. You will observe, document, provide contextual data." The researcher's voice carried no inflection through the translation filter. Resistance serves no function. He transferred the moss samples to long-term stasis that evening, 3 years of growth patterns, preserved in suspension. When he sealed the final container, his reflection appeared in the glass. 41 years old, graying at the temples, still wearing the wedding band, though Sarah had been gone 8 years. He'd stopped explaining it to people. Some habits outlived their purpose. Residential block theta occupied the station's outer ring, where artificial gravity fluctuated enough to remind inhabitants they weren't planet-side. 12 humans, the assignment brief stated, ages 26 to 53. Mixed professional backgrounds, trauma assessments pending. They would share communal spaces, kitchen, common area, hygiene facilities. Private quarters measured 3 meters by 4. The first evening, Kyle stood in the common area doorway and counted faces. 11 present. Conversations overlapped in the small space, voices carrying the sharp edge of people trying to fill silence with anything except what they'd lost. A woman near the food dispensers laughed too loudly at something. A man by the viewport stared at the dead moon's surface without blinking. Kyle recognized the performance. He'd done it himself after Sarah's funeral, accepting condolences with appropriate expressions, while something fundamental inside him sealed over like scar tissue. He took the chair farthest from the group. Someone had already figured out the coffee substitute's optimal temperature ratio. He drank it black and focused on the viewport, where Aldebaran's red light painted the lunar surface in shades of rust. "You're the scientist." Kyle turned. The woman from the food dispensers stood 3 feet away, holding her cup with both hands. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled back, exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes. "Xenobiologist," he said. "Lyra Venn. I fix things that break." She gestured at the overhead ventilation with her cup. "Which is everything, apparently. This station's older than both of us combined." "Kyle Ryson." She nodded once, a gesture that felt like closing a transaction, and returned to the dispersing group. Kyle noted the way she'd positioned herself, close enough for conversation, far enough to retreat. How she'd introduced herself through function rather than history. Adaptive behavior. Protective. The quorum's cameras tracked it all from corners he'd already identified. The observation protocols began immediately. Every morning, Kyle found a data request waiting in his quarters. Document interpersonal dynamics, note conflict resolution patterns, provide context for behavioral anomalies. The requests arrived in clinical language, but the underlying question remained consistent. Explain how humans remained functional when emotions should have rendered them incompatible with cooperative living. He started keeping field notes the way he had with the moss colonies. Objective observations. Minimal interpretation. At 0700 hours, residents gathered for morning rations. Physical proximity varied by individual comfort thresholds. At 1300 hours, work assignments distributed through central comm. Compliance rate, 100%. At 2100 hours, communal area population decreased as residents sought private quarters. But the quorum wanted more than schedules. They wanted explanations for things their models couldn't predict. Why did the humans arrange furniture in conversational clusters when individual seating proved more space-efficient? Why did they share food portions when rationing systems provided individualized nutrition? Why did conflicts, which should have escalated according to game theory simulations, resolve through physical proximity and decreased verbalization? Kyle found himself writing responses that felt increasingly inadequate. Humans are social primates. Cooperation emerges from evolutionary imperatives. The words looked hollow on the screen. True but insufficient, like describing love as oxytocin bonding and dopamine reward pathways. He thought of Sarah reading his research papers, how she'd marked sections in red. "You're hiding," she'd written in the margins. "Say what you actually observed. Trust it." The second week, the quorum assigned him direct observation hours. 6 hours daily in the common area, documenting interactions in real time. He chose the same corner chair, tablet balanced on his knee, and watched the patterns emerge. The loud woman's name was Chen. She talked constantly, filling silence with stories about her son, her work on the colony ship, the dog she'd had as a child. People orbited around her like she was generating warmth. The quiet man at the viewport was Marcus. He spoke maybe 3 sentences per day, but others sat beside him without expectation of conversation. Lyra moved between both extremes. She'd joined Chen's conversation clusters for exactly 20 minutes before retreating to the repair stations she'd set up in the corner. Her hands stayed busy constantly, recalibrating air filters, optimizing power distribution, fixing the coffee dispenser's temperature regulator for the 3rd time that week. Kyle noted the repair frequency. Systems designed to last decades shouldn't require constant maintenance. But Lyra kept finding problems to solve, reasons to stay occupied, purposes that didn't require processing grief. He understood that too. The formal interview request arrived during his 4th week. Observational lead requires direct consultation. Report to Research Chamber 7, 1400 hours. The chamber was smaller than expected, 3 meters square, climate-controlled to quorum preferences. The researcher waited behind a transparent barrier, biosuit flickering with translation matrices. "Dr. Ryson, your documentation lacks necessary depth." No greeting, no preamble. Describe the physiological function of prolonged eye contact between residents Chen and Marcus during meal period day 19. Kale accessed his notes. Chen was describing her evacuation experience. Marcus maintained visual attention throughout. Standard active listening behavior. Define active listening. Nonverbal communication indicating engagement and empathy. Quantify empathy. The question hung in the filtered air. Kyle looked at the researcher's biosuit, the way it masked every human signifier, facial expression, body language, pheromone output. They'd engineered themselves into perfect isolation and now wanted equations for connection. "I can't," he said. Insufficient response. "Provide measurable parameters." Empathy isn't measurable, it's experienced, recognized, demonstrated through behavior, but the feeling itself. He stopped, realized he'd shifted from clinical observation to something closer to admission. "It's subjective." The researcher was silent for 17 seconds. Kyle counted. Finally, "You will expand observation protocols, document physical contact patterns, proximity duration, tactile communication frequency. Provide context for each instance." Back in residential block theta, Kyle stared at his tablet. The new protocol required quantifying every touch, handshakes, shoulder pats, the casual contacts that happened during shared meals. He was supposed to measure what made them human and translate it into data the quorum could process. That night, Chen knocked on his door. "We're starting a rotation schedule. Cooking, cleaning, maintenance. You interested?" "I'm not here to—" He paused. She'd lost a child. Everyone knew. She'd told the story 16 times in various formats, like repetition could wear down the truth until it became manageable. "What do you need?" "Someone who notices details." She smiled. but it didn't reach her eyes. Lyra says you document everything. Might as well document whether we're running low on supplies. He found himself nodding. The next evening, he stood in the communal kitchen area, while Chen demonstrated the food synthesizer's optimal settings and Lyra recalibrated the temperature controls. Their movements overlapped in the small space, Chen reaching past him for containers, Lyra's shoulder brushing his arm as she accessed the control panel. Kale's tablet stayed in his pocket. He was supposed to be counting contacts, measuring duration, providing context. Instead, he noticed how Chen's constant talking quieted when she focused on tasks, how Lyra's hands steadied when working on concrete problems, how both of them had found ways to be useful, to contribute, to matter in a context where nothing else from their previous lives remained relevant. The incident happened during a routine maintenance check. Kale was documenting interpersonal dynamics in the common area when Marcus began hyperventilating. Sharp, shallow gasps that cut through ambient conversation. Panic attack, Kale's clinical training supplied. Autonomic nervous system dysregulation. Fight-or-flight response without external threat. Everyone else froze. Trained observers analyzing an unexpected variable. Kyle moved without thinking. He crossed the space, placed his palm flat against Marcus's sternum. Firm pressure, steady contact. Breathe with me, 4 counts in. He inhaled, watching Marcus's eyes lock onto his. Hold 4. Out for 4. Marcus's chest rose and fell against Kale's hand. 1 breath. 2. The rhythm stuttered, caught, synchronized. Kale counted aloud, maintaining eye contact, keeping his palm steady. 30 seconds. 40. The tension in Marcus's shoulders gradually released. When the breathing normalized, Kyle stepped back. Marcus nodded once, acknowledgement not gratitude, and left for his quarters. The common area resumed its previous patterns. Chen started a new story. Someone adjusted the viewport opacity. Kyle returned to his corner chair and opened his tablet, but his hand felt warm where it had pressed against Marcus's chest. He could still feel the other man's heartbeat, the way it had slowed under his palm. The next morning, the observational lead's request contained 47 questions about the incident. Explain the decision to initiate physical contact, quantify the pressure applied, describe the neurological mechanism of respiratory synchronization, provide comparative analysis of verbal versus tactile intervention efficacy. Kale answered what he could, but the researcher's fixation became clear in the follow-up session. You maintained contact for 42 seconds beyond observable therapeutic necessity. Explain the extension. Kyle tried to remember. He'd been focused on Marcus's breathing, on maintaining the rhythm. When had it shifted from intervention to something else? I wanted to ensure the pattern was established. Premature withdrawal could have triggered relapse. Biometric analysis indicates your cortisol levels decreased during the contact period. Explain the mechanism. I don't know. Insufficient response. I don't know, Kyle repeated. Maybe helping someone else creates a feedback loop, reduces the helper's stress in addition to the recipient's. It's a hypothesis. The researcher was silent. Then, the interaction has been flagged for extended analysis. You will be assigned collaborative work rotations with resident Ven. Document all proximity-based dynamics. Kyle understood. They'd seen something in the data, some pattern they couldn't categorize, and wanted to replicate the conditions. Study it, reduce human connection to measurable variables. The first rotation assignment arrived that afternoon. Environmental Systems Repair, subsection Theta 7. Crew, Ryson, Ven. Duration, 6 hours. The crawl space between bulkheads measured 0.9 meters at its widest point. Kyle went in first, pulling the diagnostic kit, while Lyra followed with the replacement components. The heat hit immediately, 43 degrees Celsius according to his heads-up display. Environmental regulation offline in this section. Couplings corroded, Lyra's voice came from behind him. Third one this month. Stations dying faster than their models predicted. Kyle maneuvered sideways, giving her access to the connection point. Their shoulders pressed together in the confined space. He could hear her breathing, feel the heat radiating from her skin through their work suits. Hand me the sonic wrench. He shifted, reaching back into the kit. His fingers brushed hers as she took the tool. The contact lasted maybe 3 seconds, unremarkable, functional. but his awareness of it felt disproportionate. The cameras outside were recording everything, measuring duration, cataloging proximity patterns. Lyra worked in silence, her movements efficient and precise. Kyle held the light steady, watching her hands manipulate the corroded coupling with the kind of focus he recognized from his own lab work. Total absorption. Everything narrowed to the immediate problem. "You miss it?" he asked. "Engineering. Real engineering, not emergency repairs." Her hands paused. "I designed propulsion systems for colony ships. Vessels meant to carry 10,000 people across 40 light-years." She resumed working. "This station has maybe 5 years left before critical system failures cascade. Nothing I do here matters. You fixed the coffee dispenser 3 times. She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Chen drinks 8 cups a day. Says it's the only thing that tastes like Earth, so I keep fixing it." The coupling released with a hiss of pressurized air. Lyra replaced it with practiced efficiency, her elbow bracing against Kyle's ribs for leverage. The contact was necessary, unavoidable, but he noticed how neither of them pulled away the moment the task allowed it. "All set," she said. Her voice was quieter. "Can you run the diagnostic?" He activated the system check, watching data scroll across his display. Optimal pressure, temperature regulation restored, everything within acceptable parameters. But he didn't move yet. Lyra didn't either. "The quorum asked me about you," she said finally. "Wanted to know if I felt our work assignments were deliberately coordinated, if the proximity affected my cognitive processing." "What did you say?" "That you hand me tools on time and don't talk too much." She shifted, angling to face him in the narrow space. Her face was inches from his, flushed from the heat. "They reviewed the footage 17 times, measured our biometrics. Asked me to quantify the difference between necessary touch and—" She stopped. "And what?" "Nothing. It's nothing." But she didn't look away. "We should get back." The crawl-out felt longer than the entry. Kyle's awareness of the cameras had sharpened. Every movement felt performed, documented, reduced to data points. When they emerged into the corridor, Lyra's hair stuck to her forehead with sweat. She wiped it back with her sleeve, and Kyle realized he was staring. "Same time next week?" she asked. "If something else breaks." "Something always breaks." She picked up her toolkit. "That's the thing about closed systems. Entropy's patient." The work rotations became routine, twice weekly, sometimes more when systems failed with increasing frequency. Kyle started recognizing Lyra's repair patterns, how she'd check connections he thought were fine, finding weaknesses invisible to casual inspection. How she explained technical processes while working, voice low and steady, like she needed to fill the silence with something structural. He noticed other things too. How she positioned herself in group settings to maintain visual contact with him. How her voice changed when addressing him compared to others, not softer exactly, but more careful. How she'd started finding reasons to request his assistance with tasks that didn't require 2 people. The cameras caught all of it. The observational lead's questions grew more specific. Describe proximity tolerance levels. Document tactile communication frequency. Explain instances of prolonged contact beyond functional necessity. Kyle tried to maintain clinical distance in his responses, but the observations felt invasive now, like cataloging something private without consent. "They asked me about intimacy," Lyra said one evening. They were recalibrating air filters in her quarters, a task she probably could have completed alone. "Wanted me to define the point where collaborative contact becomes something else." "What did you tell them?" "That there's no clean line. That humans don't have neat categories for proximity and touch, and—" She looked up from the filter housing. "Did you know they measured how long we stood together after that session? When I came back to the common area and you were there and I just—" She gestured vaguely. "They timed it 93 seconds, documented the synchronization of our breathing, the decrease in cortisol, like they were mapping chemical reactions instead of—" "Instead of what?" She turned back to the filter. "Forget it, just their usual questions." But Kyle couldn't forget. That moment had felt significant to him too. The weight of her forehead against his collarbone, the automatic way his arms had wrapped around her, how neither of them had moved to separate until Chen walked through needing something. 93 seconds. They'd quantified it. The next rotation, Lyra's shoulder brushed his while reaching for a tool. The contact lingered 3 heartbeats longer than necessary. She murmured an apology that didn't sound apologetic. Kyle was supposed to document this, timestamp it, provide context for the pattern analysis. Instead, he said, "You don't have to apologize." Her hand stilled. For what? Being close to someone. Needing... He stopped himself. This wasn't clinical observation anymore. The cameras don't change what's real, don't they? But she didn't pull away. Everything here is performance. We're specimens in their behavioral study. Every touch gets measured. Every conversation analyzed. How do you know what's genuine when it's all being documented? The question sat between them in the narrow workspace. Kyle thought about Sarah, how she'd complained about his field notes colonizing their personal life, coming home from work to find him documenting the household's resource distribution patterns, analyzing their conversation dynamics like they were research subjects. "You trust it," he said finally. "You pay attention to what feels necessary versus what feels performed. And you accept that sometimes observation changes the thing being observed." Lyra was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Is that what we are? Necessary?" Kyle didn't have a clinical answer for that. The summons arrived simultaneously. "Report to Observation Chamber 14, 0900 hours. Effective inquiry session, mandatory participation. Separate chambers, separate interviews." Kyle sat in the sterile space while biometric sensors attached to his temples, wrists, chest. The researcher's voice came through speakers, clinically neutral. "You will view recorded footage of your interactions with resident Venn. Provide verbal commentary on observed behaviors, emotional states, and physiological responses." The screen activated. Kyle watched himself guide Lyra through a narrow passage, his hand at her lower back. Watched how his body angled toward hers automatically. Watched the moment after a completed repair, when neither of them moved to separate. Just stood there in the confined space with her shoulder against his chest. "Describe the physiological necessity of the contact at timestamp 1437. Kyle looked at himself on screen. His hand lingered at her spine. "Stability. The passage was narrow, and the gravity fluctuates. Contact duration exceeds stability requirements by 8.3 seconds. Explain the extension." He couldn't. Not in their terms. "Habit," he tried. "Residual protective instinct. Quantify protective instinct." The questions continued. Each timestamp analyzed. Each touch measured. The researcher wanted explanations for things Kyle hadn't consciously decided. The way his hand found hers in darkness, how their breathing synchronized without discussion, the split-second hesitation before separating after shared tasks. At what point did collaborative contact transition to intimacy? "I don't know." Insufficient response. "Define your relationship parameters with resident Venn." "She's..." Kyle stopped. Colleague felt wrong. Friend seemed inadequate. The quorum wouldn't understand that human relationships existed on spectrums, that proximity and trust and physical awareness could build into something that didn't have clean categorical boundaries. "We work well together. Your cortisol levels decrease during proximity periods. Heart rate synchronizes within 8 seconds of sustained contact. Neurological patterns indicate..." "Indicate what?" Kyle interrupted. "That humans respond to connection? That physical proximity with someone you trust reduces stress? You already know this. You've documented it repeatedly. What exactly are you trying to understand?" Silence. Then, "We are attempting to model unpredictability. Emotional bonding creates behavioral patterns our algorithms cannot anticipate. Humans prioritize connection over optimization. This makes your species incompatible with systematic integration." "You mean it makes us dangerous?" "Unpredictable," the researcher corrected. "You will continue observation protocols. Pairing assignments will intensify. We require comprehensive data before final integration decisions." When Kyle returned to residential quarters, Lyra was waiting in the communal area. Her expression carried the same violated feeling that sat in his chest like a weight, the invasion of having private moments dissected and analyzed. She stood when he entered, crossed the space between them, pressed her forehead against his collarbone without speaking. His arms wrapped around her automatically. One hand cradled the back of her head. They stood that way while overhead sensors recorded everything, the synchronization of their breathing, the decrease in measurable stress markers, the neurological patterns that apparently terrified their observers. "They're afraid," Lyra said against his shoulder. "The researcher told me. Humans make them afraid." "Of what?" "Love." She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Because it can't be modeled. Because it makes us choose each other over survival probability. Because it transforms isolated individuals into something interdependent." Cale understood then. The Quorum had engineered perfect reason by eliminating connection. They'd created a civilization of complete individuals who never needed anything they couldn't quantify. And now humans, unpredictable, emotional, desperately social humans, threatened that entire framework just by being what they were. "They're initiating final phase protocols," Lyra said. "Permanent pairing assignments, isolated observation, extended monitoring." "When?" "Tomorrow." Her fingers tightened in his shirt. "We're pair configuration 7. The isolation module measured 40 square meters. 1 living area, 1 sleeping platform, dedicated hygiene facilities. Climate-controlled, acoustically monitored, visually documented from 16 angles. The door sealed with a pneumatic hiss that Cale felt in his bones. Lyra stood at the viewport, arms wrapped around herself. 40 square meters. 2 people. Indefinite duration. Her reflection appeared ghost-like in the glass. "They really think this is sustainable." Kyle set down the minimal personal items they'd been allowed. His wedding band caught the artificial light. He'd stopped explaining it years ago, but Lyra had never asked. She just noticed it sometimes, her gaze flicking to his hand before returning to whatever repair occupied her attention. "We adapt," he said. "It's what humans do. Or we deteriorate." She turned from the viewport. "That's the other possibility. That's what they're measuring. How long before proximity becomes toxic instead of necessary?" The first 3 days felt performative. Conscious awareness of cameras made every interaction feel staged. They established territories. Lyra took the left side of the sleeping platform, Cale the right. They coordinated schedules for hygiene use. They spoke in polite negotiations about temperature preferences and meal timing. But the artificial distance cracked during the first system failure. Environmental controls dropped the temperature to 14 degrees Celsius at 0300 hours. Kyle woke to Lyra shivering violently beside him, her teeth chattering. "Happens sometimes," she said through the shaking. "Backup systems are degrading. Usually fixes itself in an hour. Come here." He lifted the thermal blanket. She hesitated, then crawled closer, bringing her own blanket. They layered both, and Cale wrapped his arms around her because body heat was practical, and the cameras didn't matter when someone was cold. Her forehead pressed against his chest. Her breathing gradually steadied. The shivering eased. 93 seconds, she whispered. "What?" "That's how long we stood together after the inquiry session. You said the cameras don't change what's real, but they measure everything. They know how fast my heart beats when you touch me. They've documented every time I've chosen proximity when distance would be more efficient. They're building a model of us based on data, and I don't know which version is more true, what they measure or what I feel." Cale's arms tightened around her. "What do you feel?" "Like I'm less alone when you're close, like the thing I lost when Earth fell, that sense of mattering to someone specific, being seen by someone who pays attention. Maybe it's not completely gone." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that real or just trauma bonding in a pressure cooker?" He thought about clinical terms: Stockholm Syndrome, forced proximity, adaptive attachment in crisis conditions, all technically accurate, all insufficient. "Does it matter?" he asked. "Yes, no, I don't know." Her hand found his, fingers interlacing in the darkness. "They're going to use this against us somehow. All the data they're collecting. It's not just observation. They're building towards something." The environmental controls restored an hour later, but neither of them moved to separate. Days accumulated into weeks. The isolation module became familiar. The specific hum of the ventilation system, the way morning light filtered through the viewport at 15-degree intervals, the rhythm of two people learning to occupy space together. They fell into patterns. Lyra repaired systems from inside the module through remote access terminals. Cale analyzed biological data from the station's xenobiology archives, work that didn't require physical samples. They coordinated meals, took turns choosing entertainment programs, developed a silent language of gesture and proximity. Small rituals emerged: Morning coffee at the viewport, shoulders touching while they watch the dead moon rotate below. Evening debriefs about their work, Lyra explaining propulsion theories while Kyle described the life cycle of crystalline organisms. The careful choreography of moving through limited space, how Lyra would rest her hand on his shoulder when passing behind him, how Kyle would steady her with a palm at her waist when she stretched to access overhead storage. The touches accumulated, each one documented, measured, added to whatever model the quorum was building. But familiarity bred a kind of honesty. They stopped performing distance. Kyle started sleeping with his arm around her waist because she had nightmares about the evacuation. Lyra would wake gasping, and his hand would find her sternum automatically. Firm pressure, steady rhythm, the breathing synchronization that calmed panic without words. She started reading his field notes over his shoulder, offering observations about human behavior that were sharper than his clinical assessments. "You're describing Chen's talking like it's pathological coping," she'd say. "But maybe she just needs to keep her son alive through stories. Maybe that's not dysfunction. Maybe that's love. The quorum wants objective analysis. They want you to reduce us to equations, don't give them that." She'd lean against his back while reading, her chin hooked over his shoulder. "Trust what you observe, the real things, not the measurable ones." One evening, she asked about the wedding band. "Sarah," he said. "She died 8 years ago. Neurological degeneration, progressive and terminal." Lyra's hand covered his. "I'm sorry. I watched her disappear by increments. Memory first, then language, then recognition. The final 6 months, she didn't know who I was. But I'd sit beside her bed and hold her hand, and sometimes her breathing would synchronize with mine. Autonomic response, probably. Residual pattern recognition. But it felt like she was still there. Like some part of her remembered. Maybe she did. I documented it," Kyle said. "Kept detailed notes about her decline, cognitive assessment scores, behavioral changes. I told myself it was for medical research, but really, I was just trying to make sense of loss through data collection. Like if I measured everything precisely enough, I could find the exact moment she stopped being herself." "Did you?" "No. There was no clean line. Just gradual erosion until I was holding hands with someone who wasn't there anymore." He looked at the band. "I kept it because taking it off felt like admitting I'd failed, that all my observation and documentation couldn't save her, couldn't even preserve her accurately." Lyra was quiet for a long time. Then, "I lost my daughter during evacuation. She was 6. The colony ship's escape pods had randomized assignment to prevent families monopolizing spaces. We got separated. I have her photograph, but I can't look at it, because she's frozen at 6 years old forever and I'm here, and I don't know if that's survival or desertion. It's neither. It's just what happened." The quorum asked me to quantify grief, explain how losing her affected my integration capacity. I told them it's not quantifiable, that I wake up every morning and she's still gone and I'm still here, and those two facts coexist without resolution. They documented it as unresolved emotional liability. Kyle pulled her closer. They sat together at the viewport while the dead moon turned below, 2 people carrying losses that didn't fit into the quorum's optimization models. The system failures intensified during the 3rd month. Environmental controls fluctuated wildly. Food synthesizers produced nutrient paste with the wrong molecular composition. Lights operated on randomized cycles. Lyra spent 12-hour days routing repairs through remote access, but the station's degradation had crossed into cascade territory. "They're doing it deliberately," she said one evening. Her hands shook with exhaustion. "Testing stress responses, measuring how resource scarcity affects interpersonal dynamics. You don't know that." "Kyle, 3 systems failed simultaneously this morning. Environmental, nutrition, illumination. That's not random. They're creating pressure to see what breaks first." She looked at him, and her expression was fractured. "Us or their models." The next failure happened at 200 hours, complete pressure loss in the isolation module. Alarms shrieked. Emergency protocols sealed them into the sleeping area, 3 meters square, barely large enough for the platform. They had 40 minutes of oxygen. Lyra worked frantically at the emergency terminal, rerouting systems, bypassing failures. Kyle watched the oxygen percentage tick downward. 38%, 35, 32. I can't fix it from here, Lyra said. Her voice carried an edge of panic. I need direct access to the coupling, but it's outside the sealed section. Then we wait for rescue. What if there isn't rescue? What if this is the test? How long before we prioritize individual survival over staying together? 28% oxygen. Kyle's vision started narrowing at the edges. Hypoxia. He knew the symptoms: confusion, poor judgment, eventual unconsciousness. Come here, he said. Lyra crossed the small space. Kyle pulled her down beside him, his back against the wall, her body tucked against his chest. He could feel her heart racing, hear her breath coming too fast. Breathe with me, he said. 4 counts in, hold 4 out. Kyle, just breathe. Their rhythm synchronized, heart rates slowed. The panic in her shoulders eased fractionally. 22% oxygen. The station could let them die. This could be the final data point, measuring how humans faced mortality together versus apart. Lyra's fingers found his. I need you to know something. Don't. We're not dying here. Just listen. Her voice was quiet. When they brought us to this module, I thought I couldn't do it. Another confined space. More surveillance. More loss of control. But having you here, it made the impossible possible. Not because you fixed anything, because you paid attention. You saw me. And I don't know if that's enough to call it love in their models, but it's enough for me to want to survive this. 18% oxygen. Kale's hand tightened around hers. The pressure stabilized at 17%. Emergency protocols disengaged, the door unsealed with a hiss. An automated message. System failure resolved. Observation protocols resumed. Lyra pulled away, her expression shuddering. Told you, deliberate test. But Kyle had felt her heart against his chest, had counted the seconds she'd stayed close even after the danger passed. Whatever the quorum measured, they couldn't quantify that. The summons came at the start of the 4th month. Final integration assessment scheduled. All residents will be evaluated for systematic compatibility. Decisions are binding and irreversible. Chen found Kyle in the common area. The isolation module had been unsealed for group assessment procedures. Seeing the other 10 humans felt disorienting after 3 months of limited contact. They're separating us, Chen said. Her usual energy was gone. Sending compatible individuals to integrated settlements. Incompatible ones to... She stopped. They won't say, just alternative arrangements. Based on what metrics? Emotional regulation. Capacity for systematic thinking. Ability to function without interpersonal dependency. She looked at him. They're going to classify you as incompatible. You and Lyra both. Because you need each other. Because your biometrics are linked. Because you choose proximity over optimization. Marcus appeared in the doorway, still quiet, still precise. They gave me projections. 94% probability that pairing configurations will be dissolved. Humans function most efficiently when emotional attachments remain below quantifiable thresholds. You've exceeded those thresholds. Kyle found Lyra in the repair station she'd claimed months ago. Her hands moved through maintenance protocols automatically, but her expression was distant. They're going to separate us, she said without looking up. The integration model can't accommodate interdependency. We've become a statistical outlier. Then we refuse integration. And go where? This station is dying. The quorum controls every viable settlement within 40 systems. We don't have alternatives. Kyle thought about Earth's final transmission. 317 survivors, scattered across an empire that feared emotion. The quorum could exile them to failing stations, isolated outposts, anywhere proximity and connection could be eliminated through pure physical separation. What do you want? He asked. Lyra's hand stilled. I want to not choose between survival and you. I want to exist in a system that doesn't treat connection like contamination. I want... She finally looked at him. I want this to matter. What we built here, the way we learned to occupy space together. I want it to count for something beyond their fear. The formal integration session assembled all 12 residents in the main observation chamber. The observational lead addressed them through translation matrices, voice stripped of inflection. Final assessment complete. Integration classifications determined. Compatible individuals will be transferred to settlement designation Theta Prime. Systematic orientation begins in 48 hours. Names appeared on the central display. 8 residents. Compatible. Ready for integration into quorum society. 4 names remained unassigned. Kyle, Lyra, Chen, Marcus. Incompatible classifications indicate insufficient capacity for systematic thinking. Alternative arrangements have been determined. Transfer to Station Kappa 9, designated observation outpost for continued behavioral study. Departure in 72 hours. Kyle felt Lyra's hand find his under the table. Kappa 9. He'd read reports. Failing infrastructure, minimal resources, designed for long-term isolation research. The quorum was exiled them to die slowly, while documenting their deterioration. I have a proposal. Kyle stood. Every camera in the chamber tracked the movement. You fear human emotion because it creates unpredictability, because we prioritize connection over optimization, because love makes us choose each other over survival probability. Correct assessment, but you're missing the variable that makes that dangerous. He looked at Lyra, at Chen, at Marcus, at the 8 others who'd been classified compatible because they'd learned to suppress what made them human. Isolation doesn't eliminate emotion, it just forces it underground, and suppressed emotion doesn't disappear, it festers, creates resentment, eventually erupts in patterns your models definitely can't predict. Elaborate. You want predictable humans. Stop trying to make us function like isolated units. Instead, build systems that accommodate connection. Create settlements where humans can form families, communities, support structures. Give us something to protect, and we'll protect it. Give us something to belong to, and we'll maintain it. But try to atomize us, and you'll create exactly the volatility you're trying to prevent. The observational lead was silent, processing. Then, you propose systemic redesign based on emotional accommodation. I propose you trust that 4 billion years of evolution created social structures for a reason, that maybe cooperation and interdependence aren't bugs in human programming. Maybe they're features. Insufficient data supports this hypothesis. Then gather data. Create a settlement where humans can build community without constant surveillance, where we can form attachments without having every touch measured, where the goal is sustainable coexistence instead of systematic elimination of what makes us human. Monitor outcomes over 5 years. Compare psychological stability, resource efficiency, conflict resolution rates. If interdependent humans prove more volatile than isolated ones, proceed with your exile protocols. But if we're more stable, more productive, more cooperative when we're allowed to be social, then you have a viable integration model. Silence. 37 seconds of processing. Finally, the quorum will deliberate. Dismissed. Outside the chamber, Chen grabbed Kyle's arm. Did you just negotiate for our lives using science? I negotiated for a chance, Kyle said. Whether they take it depends on whether their fear of our emotion is stronger than their commitment to data-driven decisions. The deliberation period felt interminable. Kyle and Lyra returned to the isolation module by default. 40 square meters that had become familiar. Home almost. Lyra sat at the viewport watching the dead moon turn. What if they refuse? Then we go to Kappa 9, and we find a way to survive there. Together? If you want that. She turned to face him. I've been trying to figure out when it happened. When proximity became necessity. When you stopped being the quiet scientist in the corner and became... She gestured helplessly. This, essential. The person whose absence would be worse than exile. Kyle crossed to her, knelt so they were eye level. Sarah used to say I documented everything because I was afraid of being present. That if I could reduce life to data, I wouldn't have to feel it. She was right. After she died, I chose the most isolated assignment available because connection meant risk, meant potential loss, meant being vulnerable to pain I couldn't quantify or control. His hand found Lyra's. Their fingers interlaced automatically. But these months with you, I stopped documenting and started experiencing, stopped measuring and started trusting. And yes, it's terrifying, because you could disappear tomorrow and I'd have no protocol for that loss, no framework to make it manageable. Just the absence of someone who became necessary. The quorum would call that dependency. The quorum eliminated dependency and created perfect isolation. I'd rather be dependent and connected than optimized and alone. Lyra's other hand came up to his face, Her thumb traced his cheekbone. If they exile us, we'll find a way. I need you to know that choosing you wasn't trauma, wasn't just proximity or fear or adaptive attachment. It was recognition of someone who sees the world precisely but doesn't mistake precision for truth, who knows the difference between measuring life and living it. She kissed him. Slow and careful and certain. Kyle's hand cradled the back of her head, and he kissed her back with 4 months of accumulated proximity and trust, and the terrifying awareness that whatever they'd built could disappear in 48 hours. When they separated, her forehead rested against his. The cameras just documented that. Let them measure every second. They still won't understand it. The decision came after 37 hours of deliberation. Proposal accepted with modifications. Experimental settlement designation, community structure alpha. Population, 26 humans, current station residents, plus transfers from outpost Sigma 3. Duration, 5-year observational period. Monitoring will continue, but surveillance protocols will be reduced to aggregate data rather than individual tracking. Humans will establish autonomous governance structures, resource distribution systems, and social organization. Quarterly assessments will measure stability metrics. Failure to demonstrate sustainable interdependence will result in immediate dissolution and exile protocols. Chen started crying. Marcus smiled, the first time Kale had seen that expression on his face. The 8 residents classified as compatible were given the choice to transfer to Theta Prime or remain with the experimental community. 5 chose to stay. The settlement occupied a small moon with breathable atmosphere and agricultural potential. The quorum provided basic infrastructure, habitation modules, power generation, food synthesis capability. Everything else would be human-designed. Kyle stood at the viewport of the transport ship, watching the moon grow larger. Lyra's hand found his. "Think it'll work?" she asked. "I think 26 traumatized humans trying to build a functional society from scratch has about 17 different failure modes." He looked at her. "But if we fail, we'll fail together. And if we succeed, we'll have created something the quorum never expected. Proof that emotion doesn't make us weak. It makes us resilient." The settlement took shape over months. Chen established a communal kitchen. Marcus designed resource distribution algorithms that prioritized equity over efficiency. Lyra overhauled infrastructure for long-term sustainability rather than short-term optimization. Kyle stopped keeping field notes. He participated instead of observing, helped build gardens, mediated conflicts, learned that sustainable community required exactly the messy, emotional, inefficient connection the quorum feared. 6 months in, he and Lyra claimed a habitation module on the settlement's eastern edge. It had a viewport facing the sunrise. They filled it with small things, plants from the communal garden, repairs projects Lyra couldn't resist, books Kyle had started reading for pleasure instead of research. One morning she found him without the wedding band. "You took it off." "Felt like time," he said. "Sarah wouldn't want me carrying grief like armor. And I'm not trying to preserve something that's gone anymore. I'm trying to build something new." Lyra's arms wrapped around him from behind. Her cheek pressed against his shoulder blade. "The quorum's quarterly assessment is next week." "I know. What do you think they'll measure?" "Conflict frequency, resource distribution efficiency, psychological stability indicators." He turned in her arms. "All the metrics that miss the point, which is that we're not just surviving. We're choosing each other daily, building trust, creating meaning, demonstrating that humans don't need to be isolated to be functional. We need the opposite. We need exactly what they fear: interdependence, community, love." The assessment came and went. The quorum's report noted higher than predicted stability, lower than expected resource conflicts, and psychological metrics that indicated sustainable community formation. But Kale knew the real measurement wasn't in their data. It was in Chen's kitchen, where people gathered not because they had to, but because they wanted to. In Marcus's careful attention to ensuring everyone's needs were considered. In the garden that 26 people maintained together because it mattered to all of them. It was in the habitation module he shared with Lyra, where he'd learned to be present instead of documented, where mornings began with coffee at the viewport, and evenings ended with her hand finding his in the darkness. where they'd built something the quorum couldn't quantify, a life measured not in data points, but in accumulated moments of choosing proximity, trust, and connection over the safer isolation of being alone. The quorum had feared human emotion, but emotion hadn't made them dangerous. It had made them sustainable. It had made them human. And in that small settlement on a moon the quorum thought would fail, 26 people proved that love wasn't a weakness to be engineered out. It was the variable that made everything else possible.